Well, think about it. I mean, if you know in advance that everything is always going to go back to the way it was, then you could do anything for as long as you want without having to worry about consequences.
All right, you survived part 1. For those of you who've been keeping track, part 2 took about 5 months to complete. That was as much to do with having an incredibly busy schedule and not being able to update my page as much as I'd like, as it was anything to do with the final product being of extremely high quality and therefore needing a tremendous amount of time in order to produce. That being said, let's get right down to business. When I first discovered Anita Sarkeesian's analysis of common tropes in video games, it is probably most accurate to say that I felt a combination of relief and boredom. Relief because she was someone with an, at the time, fairly substantial platform, saying what I'd known for years, but boredom because she was saying what I'd already known for years. I'm a minority gamer, and it was just her stating the painfully obvious. I love games. I also find tons of them pretty alienating, specifically because of the symbolic crutches that they lean on to convey their story. After all, a trope isn't being inverted if the trope itself was already an inversion of my experiences and interests in the first place. For example, Far Cry 3 was meh. I mean, I loved Michael Mondo as Voss the Psycho Killer. He was fine, except of course for the fact that it's supposed to be taking place in the Pacific and he's not from the region, but, well, at least he was vaguely related to the right skin tone. Unfortunately, the only character available to play is a rich white boy who's hitting a tropical island to get high and maybe get laid by a local. He's a genuine douche bro who's never had so much as a hangnail, watches his actually military-trained brother get killed in the first 5 minutes, and yet somehow proceeds to become a weapons master and single-handedly outwit and outgun every better-armed native on the island, as well as an international drug kingpin with a private army. Solid Snake wishes he had the stones and learning curve of this anonymous 17-year-old club kid. With nothing more than an Abercrombie & Fitch t-shirt, he single-handedly ends the opium crisis. Damn, son, what does he do for an encore? Single-handedly end global warming by punching oil to death? Oh, did I mention he gets an authentic tribal tattoo with magical powers? Because he totally gets a tribal tattoo with magical powers. And if that isn't enough, it's given to him by a black guy who's moved to the island and becomes infatuated with the hot local native shamaness. Clichés ahoy. But, by the way, his inferior genes mean that she has no interest in him. Yeah, I'm not kidding about that. Oh, and also, both the protagonist's female friends are completely useless. One somehow can't work out how to escape a local former doctor who's so high he's basically perma-stoned, and the other one spends half of the runtime of the game crying. No wonder Voss wants to eat these kids' eyeballs. Terminator had more nuanced storytelling. And remember, I didn't actively hate the game. If I ignored the plot, it was reasonable as a first-person shooter. I was also acutely aware of the massive racism, sexism, and general white savior narrative that never progressed beyond the most ludicrous Trustafarian wish fulfillment. Even if every single side quest was the most magnificently designed gamer experience in the history of gaming, it wasn't. It was still painfully clear who this game was aimed at, and it was definitely not me or anyone like me or anyone who's aware that people like me even play games. At which point, it's worth mentioning, coincidentally, the main character, Jason, bears a striking resemblance to head game writer Jeffrey, who made sure to say in interviews his self-insert avatar fanfic was totes profound and not at all racist. Never mind the magical tattoo, the emasculated black guy who didn't have to be there, which certainly leaves me suspicious about Jeff's take on a few things. But more importantly, it points to some standard tropes in first-person shooters specifically designed at one audience and ignoring others. Relatedly, I finished Duke Nukem Forever out of determination alone. That game actively pissed me off. And not for the reason most might assume. It's not because Duke is a pig, or it revels in ultra-violence, near-constant misogyny, and veiled bigotry. All of that's true. No, it's for a key scene in the first part. See, near the beginning, related to nothing, the tutorial makes the player grab poop in a toilet. It's pointless. There's no other toilet in the entire game that works the same way. It comes to a screeching halt to make the player do it, and Duke mocks the player for doing it. It's the designers telegraphing, "We are doing this to you for no reason." It fully pulls back the curtain and reveals all the misogyny and bigotry and violence isn't an attempt to be edgy. It's not satire or playful. It's just mean. To the players, to the targets of the abuse, it's not born of ignorance. They're fully aware of what they're doing, and they think you deserve it for being stupid enough to buy the disc. I played through the pain of that. I earned the right to loathe everyone connected with its creation. Great graphics and adept story mechanics do not change forced choices, casually racist dude bros, or abject goons making me grab feces. Both games, frankly, I hope the villain would win. And it must be said, at least in the case of Far Cry, they kinda do, depending on the last choice that the player makes. Although, for me, it was a hollow victory, since the main character still gets laid by the now bare-breasted priestess before finally mercifully getting stabbed. Spoilers? Conversely, I clocked over 1,200 hours on Elder Scrolls Skyrim the first time through. I once played for 50 hours straight without sleeping. Or eating, if I remember correctly, although it gets a little hazy after hour 35. Not because it's the best game of ever, but the sandboxing, with the Radiant AI, unmarked locations, encouraging off-path exploration, it meant that I was invested. Most importantly, I could actually defeat the white nationalist Nords who won't shut up about how a multicultural empire is secretly out to get them by, existing on the same continent.
If you know any true sons and daughters of Skyrim, tell them to head to Windhelm. Ulfric Stormcloak wants to see them.
I came here as a hatchling. The only thing colder than Skyrim is the Nords themselves, but we stick together.
I'll fight the entire Legion myself if they dare show their faces here. I long to be out there with my brothers, waging war against the Empire. Legion soldiers gleam like fresh fallen snow and clank like a kitchen.
Only thing I hate worse than those scaled backs are them filthy greyskins.
I hope you will find a warmer welcome in your travels than we have found in ours.
Skyrim isn't very friendly for Argonians, so we mostly just keep out of the way.
It could be a season or more before we get a new shipment from the south. Not only that, but these Nords have no love for us. They look upon us and see only thieves and smugglers.
Skyrim has no use for your kind. So be it. Time to cleanse the Empire of its filth.
I got to personalize my character and my outcome according to my interests and experiences. It viscerally engaged me. Before Skyrim, I was old school. I retired my controller when the PS2 was still a gleam in Sony's eye. After over a decade on hiatus, Skyrim broke my brain. The thing is, technology changes, but a lot of design standards hadn't. Tons of games out now are virtually identical in plot and mechanics to games that were out in the 90s. Similarly, a lot of them are also avoiding the same plot considerations, which were thought to be quirky or strange back in the day. I remember, in my own play, I never liked the original Mario Brothers, for example, but I loved Mario 2. Why? Well, there was no princess to save. She's right there as a playable character. Now, in the first game, Bowser takes Peach for no reason that I could discern, and I rescue her by being side-scroll frog-marched for 5 hours. Whoopee. Mario 2, by comparison, was completely nutball. Scroll left, scroll right, go up and down, ride a flying egg a few times, and then walk into a bird's mouth. I know now that this was due to it being a reskin of Doki Doki Panic and not intended as part of the Mario canon originally, but I didn't know that at the time, and neither did anybody else. What I knew at the time was I had friends who loathed Mario 2 for exactly the reason that I loved it, the sheer wackiness of it all. It also sold literally half as well. So a lot of designers took a middle path, like Sonic the Hedgehog, who ends up with a rescue arc, but rather than some nebulous girlfriend the player has no reason to know, it's his friends being rescued from an egg-based scientist who wants test subjects for a monster factory. See, they kept the weird. And it also sold ridiculous amounts and eventually became the mascot for Genesis. Sarkeesian was talking engagement and avoiding standard storytelling devices because she was asking standard for whomst. Her detractors mostly said that she should learn to ignore things. Back on a blog that I wrote back when the Earth was still young, I said that demanding quality stories is the better option. After all, does the world truly need endless first-person shooters?
I mean, is there really any excuse for how visually unimaginative the ocean of gray-brown military shooters dominating the next-gen landscape is? Is there really an excuse for how stilted the writing tends to be, even in good games? Sadly, I think that in large part we're all too willing to accept the current scenario, where the artistic standards of the vast majority of this medium have more in common with Michael Bay than Stanley Kubrick, and we cling to even the tiny minority of games that attempt transcendent artistic vision for validation, as though the existence of one braid makes up for the ocean of bombastic emptiness all around it.
Hey guys, welcome back. I am Tim, and it's official. I haven't touched Call of Duty World War II since December. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty solid game, and when I'm playing it, I'm actually enjoying myself the majority of the time. But something about it just screams boring! It truly is just the same shit recycled over and over again, except with a few different guns, a few different maps, etc, etc. Sledgehammer Games, you didn't do anything wrong with World War II. It's just a boring-ass game, and there is a fine line between boring and bad. Big difference there. I mean,
as a game, Fortnite Battle Royale isn't even particularly great because of the way that systems interact, in particular the ways that the building mechanics are vital for defending against long-range attacks, but are also so effective for either closing distance or escaping that the mid-range effectively barely exists. The game biases extremely heavily towards shotguns, basically becoming a contest of closing distance and gaining height so you can land a shotgun headshot on your opponents. If you strip out everything else, the game is a moderately okay shooter with a unique twist and a compelling aesthetic. It's not dire, but it's kinda just barely good enough to stand on its own without the rest of the hooks.
I mean, some are almost Duck Hunt retreads. Of course, it might have something to do with the fact that there's tutorials on building your own first-person shooter in less than half an hour on YouTube. It's become the stock footage of games at this point, which means it's easy to manufacture. However, look at what Portal did and tell me again that it can't be better. I don't need depth, I want it. Still, even with that, the bulk of my blog was about men's rights activists getting all huffy about how there's no sexism in games. I wasn't really focusing on storyboarding, except for how it related to those tropes that I also could see really did exist. I barely mentioned design training players to standard behaviors and expectations. Plus, I wasn't breaking any new ground either. Movie Bob made a similar point in relation to Sarkeesian's assertions on lazy writing, and his video came out before my blog, way back in 2012. I know, because I quoted him. His contention was that the Muscle Goon character is overdone. If the story depends on reducing all men in a game to mindless vendetta machines or jealousy jocks, it masks what's probably just bad writing. Again, this wasn't his key point either. He was focused on misogynist body types in popular games. And how the occasional brilliance of a Mario 3 will never make up for a market awash in mediocre Halo reskins. H-Bomb's 2016 revisit of the concept of how a game favors one type of player over another was just a minor to his overall hate for Fallout 3. He was focused on crap characters and plot, a nonsense ending, and the industry of cookie-cutter games criticism, which was basically general style over substance. We were all talking about the same thing, but with no vocabulary to discuss it properly. And as such, we were only doing so in relation to some other more familiar and more accessible issue. As I've already discussed in Part 1, Folding Ideas, aka Dan Olson, pinpoints a lack of vocabulary directly as a key factor in a current debate within the World of Warcraft community over whether the original format was better than the current format. This idea that there is a vocabulary missing about issues that really are important has a strong presence and history in gaming circles, but it's really hard to find specifically because there is no lexicon. How messy it can become is well exemplified by the currently 423,000 subscriber strong YouTube team All Time Gaming, who produced the 2017 video 6 Franchises We're Glad Died. Plenty of other videos like this one exist in various forms, so it's as good as any. Following their list, it becomes quickly apparent that their largest complaint with whole franchises was the dependence on weak stories and cookie-cutter cliché characters and formats. For example, the Alone in the Dark 2008 reboot was an incomprehensible plot and dull gameplay. The 2010 Call of Duty had a dumb AI. Kane and Lynch had meandering levels. Their theme is pretty obvious. We hated these for bad engagement and boredom. They praised the, quote, fantastically paced horror game Dead Space, and not its follow-up Tal Volantis, which they said was, quote, a mindless action shooter with pointless microtransactions. These are a review team who complimented Kane and Lynch 2 for a scene of the main character covered with knife slices, nude, fighting his way through the streets bleeding and shooting stuff. They enjoy a side of ultraviolence, and yet they're pissed that Dead Space was, quote, ruined by becoming a Quake clone. Dead Space had specific elements of style, so players felt let down by later wrong-style versions, only they couldn't really say why beyond dumb and boring every 2 or 3 seconds. Speaking of Kane and Lynch, the game hints at a larger problem. Jeff Gerstmann founded the review site Giant Bomb specifically after being fired by GameSpot for giving Kane and Lynch a negative review. It was quite a point of drama at the time. The thing is, the marketers wanted him out. It was a PR problem for GameSpot and provides an insight into why engagement doesn't come up very much, why it's a common issue but hard to find. Part of Gerstmann's November 2007 criticism was Kane and Lynch's ugly characters.
Kane and Lynch Dead Men is an ugly, ugly game. That's not necessarily me talking just about the graphics. It's got a really ugly storyline with characters that are impossible to like, and it's a third-person shooter that has several gameplay flaws as well. Some really neat ideas are buried deep, deep in there, but you're going to have to do a whole lot of digging, more than you'll probably want to do in order to find them. You play as Kane, and in co-op you play as Kane and Lynch, who are 2 guys that are on death row. They get broken out, but before they can rejoice, it actually turns out that Lynch is in on the act, breaking Kane out so that he can reunite with this criminal organization called the Seven, who think he's a traitor, who want him to go out and get this money back because they think that he screwed him over and all this other stuff. The story gets really convoluted, and about halfway through it turns into a revenge saga, but it's impossible to care about anything that's going on in the story because every single character in the game is almost completely unlikable. There's no one to root for here, not even in like a cool anti-hero sort of way. You're just left with a bunch of really ugly characters that just become impossible to care about over time.
There's already a word for ugly as a synonym for unlikable, not even as a cool anti-hero, someone who is impossible to like. What he's describing is someone who's repellent. Reviewing Kane and Lynch 2 in August 2010, this time his complaint was the use of stock scenery and trite situations. Again, he didn't say that. What he said was he thought that the visuals were stunning, but the play was flat and standard. But by the way, not before reminding us.
Kane and Lynch 2 Dog Days is a sequel to, well, an ugly, ugly game. But beyond the basic idea of the characters and some loose references to past events, Kane and Lynch 2 bears little resemblance to its predecessor. How's about I just tell you that this is a good thing and we move on, cool?
Since we as the player are meant in some way to sympathize with those characters in order to play, since the visuals are meant to immerse us in that world, what he was describing was a feeling of alienation, something minority gamers and social scientists are well familiar with. Game reviewers hardly talk about feeling alienated at all. Gerstmann getting fired for calling a game alienating suggests that industry insiders themselves are limiting the available vocabulary specifically to limit criticism options. And by the way, there's other evidence to support this idea. Musical scores and sound design are constantly referenced in those same supposedly objective breakdowns. Well, fun fact, when the original preview came out for Hunt Showdown, fans cared nearly as much about the soundtrack as they did about the open world story and the permadeath battle royale free-for-all. Yours truly even got in on the conversation. The thing is, in my searching for the song, I discovered that Crytek only meant for it to be game-specific. Requests got so high that a song that didn't even technically exist, Rise Up Dead Man, is now available for purchase and has a vocal, instrumental, and lyric version. And they recently debuted a whole website dedicated to what started as studio engineers futzing with their sound equipment. Clearly, it landed. Emotional resonance matters. Explicitly. The number of complaints about games which recycle voice actors and dialogue, the memes about sweet rolls and arrows to the knee, gamers care about tedium just as much as H-Bomb or Movie Bob, or me. but for some reason, some of them keep saying that they don't. An example is the common claim that lag is quantifiable, but likability isn't. The programming reality is lag is easier to patch. It's easier to accommodate with a break for a microtransaction or paper over with a transition screen. In older games, those transition screens became key elements in the game, and now retro games replicate them as older gamers restore the originals for sale. Those retro and recoded games are then measured by fondness and sentimentality, and in a delightfully circular, lag becomes likability on a long enough timeline.
Number 8. The Data East Arcade Classic Collection. You cannot meaningfully view the history of the medium without the arcades. That's like ignoring silence when talking about movie history. The arcade era was the birthplace of this whole goddamn medium. It can't be ignored. There was, in fact, a lot of amazing stuff there, and that's not nostalgia talking. That's truth. And that's why the Data East Collection makes the list.
The 90s is really when the gaming industry started to explode. The growth of home consoles, stunning new graphics, and gaming was no longer just about high scores or quarters, but rather a true experience with your character. Now, some of these 90s games were so good, they still stand the test of time.
It's a tale as old as time. People do science, science goes boom, Earth explodes, and is turned into an uninhabited wasteland, but there's a lot of scrap left on the surface, namely gold, and it's your job to go in and grab as much as you can without getting killed by the government's leftover robot sentinels. Naturally, the best way to do this is on flying bikes while listening to late 90s drum and bass. Bask in the pure late 90s of it.
My favorite portable vintage video game system. In fact, I prefer it over playing games on my iPhone because I like to have tactile controls that I can feel with my fingers and that aren't covering up part of my screen. Ironically, most of my favorite games are actually games designed for the original black and white Game Boy.
A few months ago I picked up this bad boy, which is weighs a ton. It's a 486 laptop. Now, I bought this laptop primarily for DOS gaming. So I have a lot of DOS games on disc that I wanted to play on an authentic original system. Now, I used to love going down the shops with my pocket money and into the software shop and seeing all the big boxes, gorgeous artwork, and just picking out a game.
Looking at this graph of the population, the NES Classic Edition appealed to most people with skin. It was cute and functional. And because of this product, I'd argue that retro gaming entered a bit of a resurgence in major retailers. Products showed that there was a big interest in retro games. Well, we wouldn't be here without the mini console craze. But let's quickly recap the big ones so far. The NES Classic Edition in 2016 and the SNES Classic Edition in 2017. These are great love letters to fans of classic Nintendo.
Anyway, all that to say that black and white is often simpler to play than it appears at first glance. And thank goodness, because what's here is immediately captivating.
Plus, since some newer consoles and computers can't play the old games, a whole cottage industry has grown up around older machines being retrobrighted and restored, to the point that they start costing almost as much as they did when they were still on the market. All this is so gamers can play the games as they remember them, or use those same stopgaps to create nostalgia trips for older gamers once technology moves beyond their necessity, and newer gamers looking for an old game feel.
The game is ultra faithful to the design spec of the works it's throwing back to. People who don't like the original games going back to them without nostalgia, or who never really got them at the time, will not get Yooka-Laylee either. However, there are some things about Yooka-Laylee that are really interesting. In faithfully recreating a dead genre, it resurrects gameplay elements that were fun or good or useful but got lost in the mists of time. Take, for example, the level transitions. The originals needed a transition because you literally couldn't fit that much of a level in data. A standard trick in game development at the time was to have the inside and outside be two separate areas entirely with a loading zone between them. In Banjo-Tooie, the sequel, this makes the ascent up the Isle o' Hags even more impressive because the developers are successfully simulating climbing a giant mountain with numerous quite small areas where modern games could just put the whole mountain there and have you climb it. Yooka-Laylee is made in an era where you don't really need loading screens, but Yooka-Laylee still has these transitions. This shortcut to the top of a mountain is a transition when both pieces of the game world are physically there and nothing really needs to be loaded in and out. This design sensibility is throughout the game. This isn't just reusing antiquated solutions to problems that don't exist anymore. This kind of level design still has a kind of value of its own. You could have a passage inside the mouth of this cave leading all the way up to the top, but then this shortcut would be significantly longer, wouldn't it? You would have to physically climb or walk or wait in an elevator. The teleportation of sorts you get from having it just be a dark cave you walk into and come out at the top is a really convenient time saver. Keep notes, From Software.
Of course, other solutions to lag exist. There's also the option of just locking out the full number of players from being displayed on the screen and pre-recording a vast swath of in-game events and then claiming that something's happening in real time when half of it actually isn't. A disingenuous solution to a fake metric.
On February 2nd, 2019, Christopher Comstock, who performs under the DJ name Marshmello, played a 10-minute concert in Fortnite's Pleasant Park. Or, more accurately, at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, players who joined a special Marshmello concert game mode got to watch a scripted concert event during which weapons and damage were deactivated to ensure that players couldn't be griefed and that the event wouldn't be interrupted with gunfire and explosions. It's maybe a bit of a pointless hair to split the fact that the concert was pre-recorded and not actually live, but I mean, that's what we do here. We deconstruct narratives, and the idea that this was a live set was very much part of the narrative. The crowd does end up looking a little thin because it turns out 60 people per match just isn't that many if you're trying to simulate an actual audience, but players maneuvering virtual bodies need a bit more space to do things than real people, and keeping the population low mitigated problems with players who are accessing on lower-end hardware.
Criticizing engagement, on the other hand, requires revamping the entire design process. But that's the thing. Any engineer can attest, games always lag. They wouldn't need to limit the number of people in a room at the same time if they didn't. Power fluctuations, signal drops, script errors, most players never even notice. Lag is only a problem if it interrupts. Lag really means annoying lag. If others agree that it's excessive, a metric is born. Except annoying is a feeling. They've quantified an emotion and claimed that they didn't. So why stop at lag? Relating metrics and emotions back to how games get discussed, All Time Gaming praised the early Prince of Persia series as pretty and fun to play, but with no learning curve, so it was accessible to even novice players. Excuse me, pretty isn't measurable. The number of pixels is, but pixels isn't attractiveness. Confirming the point, their complaint of Prince of Persia was that the series later became a processor-taxing pixel fuck. By the way, that's a real term. Only to deliver convoluted stories. Convoluted? They're basically saying, sure, it runs Crysis, but if Crysis is just Daikatana or 100 other meaningless reskins of the same 2009 first-person shooter tropes, who cares? Which is roughly the same complaint that Gerstmann had about Kane and Lynch and H-Bomb had about the headsplosions in Fallout 3.
You can say what you like, but this, for me, is the defining moment of Fallout 3. It's the most telling portion about the priorities in the game's development and the most straightforward expression of all its problems and mistakes, and it's about 10 seconds of gameplay. You walk into the final chamber with the water purifier. Autumn's here. In the course of 3 sentences, you talk him down, he gives up, and goes to walk out. On his way, I remember this guy doesn't deserve to walk out of here. I have an obligation to stop him. Fuck that guy! I'm gonna shoot him in the face with a butter knife I stole from his own base. Look at this frame for a moment. They probably had to look up diagrams and do research for this. The character stands for nothing. He turns on a dime. Planet Xbox 360 gave Fallout 3 a 9.8, saying, "The presentation of the game as a whole is what really takes Fallout 3 and boosts it into a level high above most of the other games being released this year." Presentation. That site now redirects to a clickbait site because it turns out game reviewers really did at some point get purged the way I said they should earlier. The developers spent their time on the presentation. On this. Not on the writing.
In contrast, reviews for indies often flat out ignore standard metrics and embrace the emotional engagement of the medium. Since common terms are limited, many reviewers are reduced to saying, "It really resonates," or "It was really compelling." They go with their heart. There isn't a vocabulary for heart. All-Time Gaming aren't just fussy. They're addressing an action-adventure failing as an action-adventure, fantasy horror devolving into a mindless shooter. Except they have words for genre, but not ungenre-like. The guys at All Time Gaming like an FPS as an FPS, but not an FPS that's pretending to be a role-playing game, and yet they were unwilling or unable to simply call it misleading. Which handily brings me back to my introduction, precisely the kind of alienation felt and expressed by the likes of minority gamers and indie developers the whole time. So, to that end, let's build a dictionary. I'll start where I got my inspiration. H-Bomb called his main issue player conditioning. It's as good a term as any. As stated previously, his example was an early task in Fallout 3 where the first level character hits a required lock. One can attempt to pick the lock, or just find the key that's hidden nearby. In other words, there's a built-in cheat. As he says it, the game itself teaches you should avoid doing difficult tasks if you can. He expanded on this in the video Bloodborne is Genius and Here's Why. In fact, he even discussed how he'd initially skimmed over player conditioning and wanted to flesh it out more fully. He notes that he enjoyed the Dark Souls series more than most of his friends, and poking around, he found many of them were annoyed by battles early in the game, which could only be won with a specific and confrontational strategy. This taught some players new tactics, but conservative players just died a lot because they avoid single-option fights whenever possible, based on the previous games that they've played. When they complained, "Practice more and get good," was the normal reply, and they kind of gave up. It turns out, game players have a limited vocabulary as game reviewers. However, H-Mom found that many who reportedly hated Dark Souls found Demon Souls much more accessible, but for a very specific reason.
Critically, the entire Souls series, even Demon Souls, have done quite well, but plenty of players didn't like Demon Souls and a few critics did agree with them. Take for example Yahtzee, everyone's favourite fast-talking English sweary man, who I'm not jealous of at all.
So in conclusion, fuck you, Demon Souls. A challenge is one thing, but trying to break down a fucking cement wall with your forehead isn't a challenge, it's grounds for getting fucking sectioned.
That's a pretty emphatic no to what Demon Souls is doing, I think. I remember people on forums at the time echoing his feelings about it. It's trial and error, you have to take it slow to do well, and that just isn't fun, and so on. At this point, it's worth mentioning that, yeah, Dark Souls did gangbusters. It got super popular and had a massively committed following, many times the size of the one Demon Souls ended up with, and even Yahtzee came around on it. But hang on a second. Let's check out why.
After watching a decent Let's Play of the game, gone over the wiki a few times, and a 6-week preparation with a team of advisors and physical trainers, I was able to break through the wall. And I suppose that's the first failing of Dark Souls, that you need the fucking Cliffs Notes to get into it.
It's hard to recommend a game to someone and say, but first, here's all the research you have to do. Because that person's gonna say, you know, you say this game's more fun than Zelda H-Bomb, but Zelda doesn't require me to read any technical manuals or peer-reviewed journals and watch someone else play it for a few hours first.
He tied his realization about player training and conditioning to his previous criticism of Fallout 3 having a high-cost task with a cheat waiting around the corner. Conservative gamers rely on finding those cheats. It conditions the players that if a high-cost task is presented, there will be a simple trick to avoiding it, making every high-cost task a fake-out. Demon Souls introduced an early high-cost task, but it does so with a high-reward payoff and no chance to skip the fight. Confirming his theory, he found even those who disliked Demon Souls liked Bloodborne, and he had a very specific suspicion why.
So it isn't just that Bloodborne is a better game than the others, although that is kinda true in my opinion. Bloodborne changes people's perspectives on a more subtle level. I have a theory about this game. No, I have a hypothesis about this game. Bloodborne teaches you how to enjoy Souls games. Let me show you just a couple of the design differences that seem small, but have a massive, massive difference on the mindset of players. Firstly, the most obvious one. There's no shield. Where is it? It's not there! You don't start the game with a shield at all, no matter what. This is genius. The shield has been the bane of the Souls series from the very start. It's the true villain, and it's precisely because of its function and use. Let's go back.
Ah, the shield. A classic. You hold a button down and you're immediately protected from obvious harm you're facing. You can just block the attack, and then attack when there's an opening. This game's not so hard. Just hold the shield button.
Welcome to having a shitty time. The fun, frenetic dodge mechanic and the incredibly engaging parry stuff is immediately foreclosed by a much safer option. Can you imagine being in the room when Hidetaka Miyazaki was looking at playtest footage of the previous games and coming up with the concept for Bloodborne, and he was like, hey, take out the shields.
The previous games had flawed conditioning, which affected their engagement, and Bloodborne resolved the disconnect. More important, it taught through gameplay, not endless tutorials, because gamers already know most tutorials are misleading if they bother using them at all. That requirement of play differently now made the Dark Souls series less accessible as a result. Not less famous, just much harder to get into. Gamers love all sorts of games, but no one complained that Angry Birds was hard to figure out. Player conditioning is part of what I'll call chording, or how the characters' various interactions and strands of story contribute to the mini-plots, which then weave into a central plot and outcome. You know, like several notes working together to make a chord. It's related to Mr. B-Tongue's shandification. But he was talking about the concept of design. I'm talking about the result to the player. It also works for describing parts which don't work together, because they're discordant. Shandifying a story for shandy's sake doesn't mean much if there's no way to resolve all the strands into a coherent narrative. Relatedly, Zegal's how this all fits together in a self-contained universe and the reality where the character's story unfolds, I'll call that verse crafting. And in the next video, I'll break down what these are and why they're important, and then finish by covering why I think this matters not just to gaming, but more broadly to the issues surrounding games, game criticisms, and gameplay. Thank you very much for listening. If you like what you've seen so far, please feel free to like and subscribe. I do have a Patreon. Unfortunately, I don't actually have enough subscribers yet to link it directly in the screen, so have a look at the information down in the doobly-doo. Otherwise, I thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have fun. Shout out to Capri Omni, whose generous donation has helped to make this possible. I hope you've enjoyed yourself so far, and I hope you continue in future. Thank you very kindly.